Hello, Meoni here, and this is another Final Fantasy XIV related video for you. But this one I thought was a little bit entertaining, so I had to share this. Browsing Reddit, I actually came across this thread, which I'll link in the description below. But there was a link directly to a website called domain.com.au, which is an Australian news site. And in particular, they're mentioning how a video game proved that increasing supply won't fix the housing affordability crisis. This is actually to do with Australian property, and as I quote here, already there are 90,000 properties sitting empty in Sydney and another 20,000 empty homes in Melbourne. Sooner or later, all the investors will have all the empty apartments they want, and then everyone else can have a go. This is in reports of the house prices in Sydney and indeed Greater Australia, including Melbourne. And the entertaining thing here is that they're comparing that the most effective way to tackle housing affordability is to increase supply, and saying basically how that will not actually be a solution to the housing crisis. It's not so much the idea that there's lots of houses, there's lots of empty houses being built and unoccupied simply because the house prices are insane. And they're not coming down at all. The house prices are skyrocketing in Australia. And where Final Fantasy comes in is that this particular article wanted to compare the real world essentially to how Final Fantasy XIV handled its housing crisis. In a genuinely hilarious example of real-world economics intruding upon a mystical fantasy realm of dragons and intrigue, it turns out that the housing crisis is not exclusive to flesh and blood humans. Final Fantasy XIV is a multiplayer online role-playing game in which players create a character to complete tasks, have adventures, form guilds with other players, go on quests to find treasure and increase their skills, and swear furiously at how impossibly slow Australia's internet is compared with pretty much everywhere else, which is incredibly accurate if you've ever been over there. They say every so often the developers, the games company Square Enix, add new features to keep people involved, and last year one of these was the ability to buy virtual property in the game's fictional setting of Eorzea. So they got that wrong here. This is the new Shirogane plots they're talking about. The problem with this, that only 2,000 housing plots were made available per server, and the wealthy guilds and individual players with a lot of time on their hands to accumulate the necessary in-game means snapped them all up immediately, exactly as you would expect. Other players were outraged. How could today's ambitious young hire break into the property market when these sort of players had it all sewn up? Could they maybe buy into the blasted hellscape of Eureka and rent vest in the nicer, more gentrified bits of Eorzea? How does negative gearing even work in this universe? Not really sure what they're going on about there, but it's kind of entertaining to read this. I will link this obviously in the description. If you've got 5 minutes, it's just comedy, basically. Anyway, they say, Square Enix heard the furious cries of their customers and did exactly what Turnbull et al. Would suggest. They increased supply. Over 700 new plots were made available per server, which were immediately brought up, exactly like the original ones. What mitigated the problem? Increasingly delicate regulation. In the end, Square Enix put limits on how many homes a player could own, and put in a waiting period for resellers to discourage profiteers from flipping properties at a premium within the game, and are still assessing whether more regulations are required. In other words, the company responsible for an online adventure game with trolls is giving more assiduous attention to accessibility than the government of our most populous state. They say, and frankly that should give us pause. If the magical fighting folk of 14 can't make their housing system work, what hope do Australians have? Heck, most of today's young people can't even cast a Fundaga spell, much less find a place within a reasonable commute to their jobs. What a fantastic story. I know there's a lot of misunderstanding of how the game works, but I find the fact that this is direct relation to a real world problem, and they're using 14 as an example is just entertaining. We all know that the housing crisis was handled incredibly poorly when the first housing rollout came out. I'd like to think that a lot of the changes that happened when they reintroduced new plots, when they implemented the personal housing restrictions and made it so that free companies had a chance to, actually get property, a lot of the property was still left unattended, and it did actually give people an opportunity to get housing for their guilds. I think in many ways Final Fantasy XIV did actually solve the housing problem, or are in the process of solving a housing problem. A link will be in the description. I thought this far too entertaining not to share with you. Thank you very much to the Redditor who posted this, and I will see you all next time.